Laura Kyrke-Smith.
Thank you, Dr. Hook, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend, the member for Huddersfield, for securing this debate. The crisis in Sudan is something that we should all be seeing on our TV screens and our social media feeds and debating here in Parliament every day, and yet tragically it barely features. So I think my honourable friend's success in securing this debate is all the more commendable. As we've heard so powerfully, in just over 2 years, 28,000 people have been killed, 12 million people forced to flee their homes, half of those children, 15 million children in need of humanitarian assistance. The human impact of this conflict is truly shocking, and we know that in North Darfur the situation is particularly dire. El Fasher has been described as a city under siege. Zamzam refugee camp, we've seen people, starving people, attacked. And aid agencies tell me that an estimated 450 to 500,000 people have now fled from there onto Tawila, living out currently in the open in extreme heat with barely any food or water or and diseases like cholera taking hold. And I think with the fighting now escalating in the Kordofan region, this looks set to be the next area of really acute humanitarian crisis. And as we've heard from other honourable members, this is no accident. This is the result of a strategy by warring parties to, at best, allow civilians to be collateral damage in a vicious fight, and at worst, deliberately and directly target them. But let me turn to what needs to be done. And as I think about what needs to happen in Sudan, in many ways this feels like a test of how we act in response to humanitarian crises more broadly in these new times, where our humanitarian aid budget is reduced, but our deep expertise and leverage in humanitarian action remains. And of course the first thing to say is that funding is important, as it will be in any humanitarian crisis. The 120 million that the UK committed to Sudan at the London conference in April, part of that 810 million aid package, will support 650,000 people with basic life-saving aid this year, and that's something that we should be really proud of. What we do with this funding matters, and increasingly I think we're good at focusing on those interventions that have proven to work, like the use of RUTF to treat severe and acute malnutrition. And who we fund also really matters. And I think Sudan is an example of why we have to get funding to the local responders in any humanitarian crisis, but in this case particularly the emergency response rooms and others, who are these extraordinary networks of volunteers embedded in communities, running community kitchens, feeding hundreds of families, operating mobile clinics, restoring basic infrastructure, doing the work that international humanitarian aid agencies in this context are unable to do. But there are 3 further ways beyond funding in which our actions can have an important impact, I think, in the crisis in Sudan and beyond. The first point is pushing for expanded humanitarian access. Large parts of Sudan are completely out of reach for the UN and international aid agencies, something that is completely unacceptable given the scale of humanitarian need. So we must keep up that pressure on the warring parties and on their external backers in Russia, the UAE and elsewhere to allow that aid to flow in. But Sudan also shows why we may need new tools, whether it's Yemen, Myanmar, or of course Gaza. The denial of access of humanitarian aid has become a routine part of warring parties' playbooks, and we urgently need to find ways to create more expectation, more pressure. And I think, for example, of the recommendation of my former employer, the International Rescue Committee, who have suggested that we should set up a new international mechanism to monitor and protect humanitarian aid access, but that's just one idea. The second point is how we use our diplomatic assets and tools to push for a ceasefire and a peaceful resolution to the conflict. As one of the emergency response room spokespeople has recently said, we cannot continue to respond to the crisis while the guns keep firing. The people of Sudan need a ceasefire now to save lives and to rebuild our communities. And we have the opportunity of being the penholder on Sudan in the UN Security Council. I know we're rightly working with the African Union, the EU convened group and others to make progress. And I know we're looking outside of these established groups too, rightly, which I suspect will be increasingly necessary, finding these informal coalitions of interested countries to work together for peace. And I know it's complex and sensitive diplomacy, but it could not be more urgent. The third point I wanted to make is how we drive more accountability in these contexts for breaches of international humanitarian law. Last month, I think it was 5 aid workers killed in an appalling attack on a UN convoy near El Fasher. I'm glad to see that we called for accountability at the time, but again, we're seeing this sustained pattern of these attacks on aid workers in Sudan and elsewhere. I know in the case of Sudan, the International Criminal Court's Office of the Prosecutor has now found reasonable grounds to believe that war crimes and crimes against humanity may well have been and continue to be committed in Darfur, and we have to be clear that this is absolutely unacceptable. So the crisis in Sudan I see as a test of our compassion, but also of our capability in responding to humanitarian crises in the world today, a test of whether we can... Yeah, absolutely.
I thank her, and I thank her for her speech. She will know that we said never again in Rwanda and Srebrenica after the Holocaust, but we are clearly not living up to that promise. Doesn't she think we need a comprehensive atrocity prevention and response strategy that has been lacking, I believe, in the UK government for a number of years now?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for her intervention, and I do agree that that's what's at stake here, and I know, I'm sure the Minister will say more. I hope that we, and I think that we are looking at that atrocity prevention strategy, and that we need to be looking at updating that. But I'll just conclude by saying, to me, this is a test, Sudan, of whether we can successfully push to get aid into these most awful humanitarian crises in the world, a test of whether our diplomacy can play that stabilising role and help be a force for peaceful solutions, and a test, as my honourable friend says, of whether those who violate international humanitarian law will be held accountable to their actions, and that matters for the victims of the conflict in Sudan, but it also determines what warring parties think they can or can't get away with in future conflicts. I know the Minister is aware of lots of this and feels these pressures, and I look forward to her thoughts.
Yeah.